online joining us from abroad, Dr. Usman Chohan. He is the senior economist. Most welcome to you, Dr. Thank you very much for your presence online. My first question to you, Dr. Dr. Usman, that after the staff level agreement, Pakistan is expected to enter into another International Monetary Fund extended fund facility, and it took country at least a time to avoid acute debt and financial or fiscal crisis. But how much it's true that in long run this debt burden must have to be managed in a due course, that it must have to be in a rational form, how to increase growth particularly and then create employment and reduce poverty, because these are the benchmarks and Pakistan needs to attain.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure. When you speak of the IMF's extended fund facility, you are considering Pakistan's reforms and its austerity paradigm. So Pakistan right now is in an austerity paradigm where it is trying to curb inflation, it's trying to restructure important entities, and it's trying to put itself onto a future growth path. But you cannot stay in this austerity paradigm and then also expect growth, because austerity is the opposite of growth. So inshallah, once this austerity phase is over and the fundamentals have been set correct in the federal structure, provincial structures, as well as private-public partnerships, the private sector's role, credit, and so on, when all of these fundamentals are set correct, then you will have the opportunity to develop a growth strategy that is long-term and meaningful. So that should be seen as a second phase once austerity paradigm is set to its fruition and completion.
Definitely, your point well taken. Usman, Asian Development Bank suggests Pakistan's GDP growth rate at 2.8%. Fitch estimates 3.2%. IMF projection is 3.5% as compared to the government growth rate target of 3.6%, while 5.4% growth rate is of the regional emerging markets. So whether through existing government efforts will we be able to attain 3.5% to 3.6% GDP growth rate during the current fiscal year?
Yes, it's a good question, because we certainly can, but there's reasons for achieving a 3.5% GDP target, which is actually that we have a low base year to target. So when we measure GDP, we are looking at it on a year-to-year basis. So the past 2 years, the GDP has been at a very low click, very low rate. So if you have such poor figures for 2 years, then a subsequent year mathematically becomes easy to achieve, so long as you also have other factors. And those factors are whether inflation remains comparatively low, whether energy prices globally stabilize, whether we have the incipient efforts towards the reinvigoration of our industry, and certain other elements. Then achieving 3.5 on an easy base year is in fact possible. But the real question is whether we can look at GDP targets of 3% over 5 years or 6% over 5 years, meaning longer horizons of analysis would be much useful. And for that, we do need to come out of this austerity paradigm with a much firmer footing. That is very important for us to have a longer horizon of growth rather than just look at the oncoming year of growth.
Definitely, you are absolutely right, because we have to follow at least the strict economic policies, reforms and all that, so that we can achieve, this is not going to be beyond any sort of a target. So Pakistan's debt burden actually is the major chunk which is actually eating the major chunk of the revenue. ADB, or the Asian Development Bank, predicts that it will ease at least to 70% of the GDP during current fiscal year, but estimated interest payments are expected to require a staggering 62% of the fiscal revenue. So up from at least 41% when we compare it to fiscal year 2022-23, while government has rupees 9.8 trillion or 76% of the total tax target of rupees 13 trillion for the interest payment. So how do you see that from where we get the fiscal space to retire our debt, to repay some sort of the interest payments, or to get something out of that for the development expenditure? So this is going to be a very vicious cycle and a very acute kind of formula.
Yes, this is how we normally frame the debate in common discourse, that we have a huge ballooning of our interest payments, and that our total direct and indirect taxation is about as much as the interest we have to pay. So it seems very scary. But in fact, there are two components to our interest payments, or even to our borrowing. One is the foreign borrowing interest payments, and one is the domestic borrowing interest payments. They're kind of lumped together for a general analysis. But the foreign borrowing is at very low rates, and that is for a foreign currency. That's not as scary a thing as our domestic borrowing, which has been huge because it has been at a very high interest rate. Our base rate has been above 20% for a long time now, for 18 months at least. And so we are borrowing from our own banks at a very high rate that we set for institutions that operate in our jurisdiction. And they, because of this, announce record profits. The banks of Pakistan announce record profits every quarter, quarter after quarter. So they're having a very good time, while overall our economy is perhaps not having as good a time. So I think that there has to be very serious conversations about banking reforms on the liability side, because this is the product of our State Bank of Pakistan Amendment Act, where previously the central bank was the provider of liquidity to the government. Now it doesn't do that role anymore. It does it via the banking channel, the private banking channel. So we have to take a very good look at our domestic banking system and why they are enjoying record profits when we are not having a record economy. And there's plenty of things you can do to the banking system, from the very benign, like a liability restructuring, all the way to more serious stuff where you consolidate the balance sheets in a serious manner. But our domestic banking system cannot have so good a time when the overall economy is at a very different trajectory. So I advocate for very strong banking reform, and I don't want to see anybody having record profits until we as a whole, as a society, are doing much, much better.
Your point well taken, Dr. Usman. Usman, how you analyze the Fitch Pakistan country risk report projections that suggest an inflation goes down? If that goes down, key policy rate might also cut down to 16.4% by December 2024 and 14% by December 2025, from 20.5% in June 2024. Just we have the last month. In that, meanwhile, a budget deficit would slip a bit to 6.7% of the GDP in current fiscal year, from 7.4% during the last fiscal year, whereas the current account deficit would remain at an average of 1.1%. It is going to be difficult for the government as well to finance that. So how do you see that?
Yes, this country risk report, I think, is quite positive in the sense that it forecasts a decline in inflation over the next 2 years, calendar years. And I think that is a reasonable sign, although inflation is a little bit difficult to predict these days, not just because of local context, but very much because of global geopolitical context. So the reserve rate, or the Reserve Bank's base rate, depends on their calculations of forward-looking inflation. And it has come down considerably over the previous 2 months, but it isn't clear how it'll be over the next 6 months. And that makes it difficult to forecast how the base rate should come down. The IMF itself encourages, or is totally in favor of, the state bank maintaining a high rate. But in order for us to realize economic growth, we actually need a much more decent, lower base rate to begin to start economic activity. Therefore, I believe that if the Fitch country report is correct, it is quite good, because emerging markets generally have higher inflation, but having catastrophic interest rates is in nobody's favor. We do want to see more gradually declining inflation that is stable so that businesses can start to make key decisions. The central bank brings its rate down. So overall, if it does materialize as they forecast, I think it would be a very good thing.
Definitely, it brings a real-time economic stability in the country. So, Dr. Usman, do you think that rupee and foreign exchange reserves stabilization actually both depend on the inflow of dollar? So, if the state bank make the debt servicing likely due to because we have some of the debt payments due in July and or in August, start of August next month. So then reserves actually fall and the currency might depreciate, and it is slightly depreciating right now, which has we have seen the last 3-4 months a bit stabilization, no big fall we have seen. So reserves still bit critical, but at the moment that is around overall, if we just imagine that 9.42 billion dollars with the state bank, some 5.27 billion dollars with the commercial banks, it's accumulative, it's 14.7 billion dollars. So how do you see this situation?
That's a very tricky question. Currency flows are difficult to predict, but two things that we can be certain of. One is that Pakistan has always met its sovereign payments on time. Even in the difficult period we faced over the last 2 years, we did meet everything on time, and we also negotiated for certain rollovers or extensions to try to ease that burden. But every obligation that we did have to meet, we met on time. So this is something that is in our favor. The second thing is that there has been a very careful curtailing of the foreign exchange market to prevent speculation. The consequence of that is that it is quite difficult for regular people to procure dollars, or even smaller businesses to procure dollars. For large businesses, it's okay because they have their own reserves, but it's generally very hard. But the trade-off there is that there is a very tight bandwidth within which the Pak rupee US dollar rate is kept.
Dr. Usman, how do you see IMF's suggestion to have national fiscal pact among the federal and provincial governments to have more provincial tax collection and revenue generation, more spending on education, health, social protection, regional public infrastructure investments, and improve the public service?
Thank you for this important question. I think this is the single most important reform that, if we implement, could change the fiscal architecture and its sustainability. The way that our center and our provinces are currently dealing with the budget, it is not sustainable. It is terrible. And in fact, if you have the federation as a revenue raising but provinces as spending units, you have a great mismatch. So the National Fiscal Pact would put more onus on the provinces to raise their own revenues and therefore spend them according to the local needs. I think this would be the most wonderful thing we could have to remedy the distortions created by the 18th Amendment. So I'm strongly in favor of this measure.
So, Dr. Usman, why not to focus on multifaceted and dynamic national reforms, resolve existing economic challenges through innovation, investing in research and development, attract foreign investment by mainstreaming countries' talent, give tech and financial support to the potential human resource, reform state sectors like state-owned enterprises privatization, curtailing government expenditures, pension reforms, strengthen economics as governance, create conducive environment for the private sector?
I fully agree with this suggestion. I think that is a very good blueprint. What it requires is political will. What it requires is removing vested interests out of the way, and also really prioritizing these things in partnership with other stakeholders in society. It's not just for government to do these sorts of things, it is all of society together. But what you have just given as a summary blueprint is wonderful, and I fully endorse it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Usman, for your time online. I'm really happy that you have elaborated, described things very well. Thank you very much for your time.